again with that despondent voice, recording in progress. Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another session of Sustainable in the City, Thinking Upstream. I'm Patrick King, joined by my co-hostess with the mostest, Jenn Harrman. And we have our guest today, Kamilah Sanders. And we're going to be talking about sustainable fashion very, very shortly. But as with every session that we do, how's everybody doing today? It's a hot one. So especially if you're in the Nashville area, you are probably inside, unless you have a really nice outdoor setup that keeps you cool, in which case I'm a little jealous. And I have not had, Jenn, have you had lunch yet?
I ate an apple. So I'm on the healthy train. I'm really excited about my lunch though after this, because I made Indian food this week.
Mm-hmm.
I always get excited when I make Indian food, so.
As you should, yeah.
Super excited.
So, yeah, I like how I asked, have you had lunch yet? And you said I've had an apple. That sounds like a no to me.
The answer, well, I've had my pre-lunch,
Mm-hmm.
if you will. Pre-lunch.
Sure.
Pre-lunch.
Ooh,
also known as a snack. Go on.
That's a snack. Do I have co-host capabilities?
You should have co-host capabilities. Is it showing? I did. Yes.
It does it? Okay. Well, yeah, I have this.
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, everybody, what are you all having for lunch? If you've had lunch yet, I'm gonna do some Greek food after this session. I find it really beneficial to not talk about things like sustainable fashion on a full stomach. Not that there's anything gross about it. It's just it's a weighty topic. How about that? I learned a lot in doing research for today's session.
Yes, it's going to be a very, very good one today. So glad to have so many of you folks with us. And of course, we'll get started here just very shortly. Mm-hmm. Just giving everybody a second to get in, get themselves settled, get your lunch ready because we can't see you. See, if we were eating lunch, you'd watch us eating lunch. You don't want to be doing that.
And that makes for really bad audio, listening to Jenn and I eat. So
that is very true.
You don't want to do it.
No crunching.
None of it.
Well, it doesn't look like anyone is having lunch today.
Hey, well, we're right there with you. Join the club.
That's fine. All right. Well, it's a couple minutes after. Patrick, are you okay if we get started? Think we're ready to go?
I think I'm good to go. Yeah, let's do it.
All right. Well, welcome everybody to Sustainable in the City, Thinking Upstream. A couple of things before we get started. As always, we've got the chat panel open. So if you've got questions, please throw your questions into that chat panel because we'll get a chance to ask both of our speakers technically today, any of the questions that you have and get those answered for you at the end of our session. Or if you're having any other issues or have thoughts, ideas, share all that stuff in the chat. It is yours to use and we'll be following that and keeping an eye on that for you. Other than that, I think the other thing is to follow the Urban Green Lab YouTube playlist that has all of our Sustainable in the City Thinking Upstream episodes. So all those get posted there. So if you've missed one in the past, we've had a lot of really great stuff over the year. Make sure you catch up on all those episodes. I'll drop a link to that in the chat. And with that, we'll go ahead. Today is very exciting because Patrick is going to start us off with a little bit of a primer to get us all ready to talk to our guest speaker today, who is an expert in sustainable fashion. So Patrick's going to give it, let y'all know a little bit of history and some background. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Patrick.
Whew. Thank you so much, Jenn. And let's see if I can get the screen share, doing a little bit of finagling here. Okay. And then if I do this, everybody can see.
Nice.
All right. Am I visible here?
Yes, you are. Good to go.
All right. So before we get going and talk a little bit more about sustainable fashion, I just wanted to do a quick primer on the subject. This is something that I had a cursory knowledge about, but not something that I had a lot of information on. So I think it'd just be helpful to kind of just lay a historical background on fashion at large, taking a look at the Industrial Revolution and kind of seeing how that led to the state of fashion as we know it today. One thing to know about fashion, it is a very weighty topic. There's tons and tons of information on the subject. So by no means am I doing the subject justice. We're just going to do a very, very broad, I can't explain how broad this is going to be for you all, but it is going to hopefully give you a place of understanding that we can work from to kind of look at that present state of things. And I will follow up in that email that we always send up after these conversations. In that follow-up email, I will include all the sources that I used for today's presentation. So without further ado, let's get it going. Right now, I'd be willing to wager $5 that everyone on this Zoom call right now is wearing some form of fashion. It could even just be your socks and underwear, a t-shirt, what have you. But that's kind of how it's been for much of human history. As long as there's been humans, we have had some sort of garment on our body, no matter where we are, either in Norway, the Arctic, sub-Saharan Africa, wherever it may be. Wherever there are humans, there are garments and or clothes. And I would probably also wager that as long as there have been humans that have had a preference about which garment to wear over another, and that is kind of where fashion was born. But for most of human history, clothing was handmade, with garments being produced individually. You didn't really see too much of mass production of garments, although there are some cases, thinking of the Roman military, wherein I think it was 100 laborers in a sweatshop would produce different articles for the Roman army. And we can also see that in ancient Babylon. But throughout human history, we haven't really seen much in the way of mass production for consumers, or at least that's how it was in antiquity. Before 1300 CE, people did not wear form-fitting garments in the Middle East. Folks wore loose-flowing robes. In medieval Europe, folks wore linen under their tunics and wool top tunics. These were made of very, very durable fabric, and typically they lasted a lifetime. Typically, women also spun these fabrics, typically from wool, into thread, with more specialized work being done by men to weave them into fabrics at home workshops. And here in this image, we can just see different forms of fashion from different cultures across the world. Again, as long as there have been humans, there have been clothes, and as long as there have been clothes, there's been fashion. Now, even today, while much of the production is fully automated, garments are still sewn and pieced together by human hands using sewing machines. And right here, what we're looking at are garment workers in New York City in 1937. Now, while this picture is a little antiquated, the machinery is a little bit newer nowadays, but this process still goes into the clothes that we are most likely wearing right now. Typically, while wool and fabric production is automated, again, these clothes do have to be pieced together by human hands. So there's a high likelihood that the clothes you're wearing right now have touched human hands before you pick them up from the store, Goodwill, or what have you. Now, textile production was a very complicated and time-consuming task before the Industrial Revolution, which began in England around the 1760s. Raw materials such as wool, flax, and cotton needed to be spun by hand into yarn or thread, and then from there woven into garments. Weavers created fabrics at home or in small workshops on looms and spinning wheels, which we can see right here. This is a woman on a spinning wheel. And then from there, they got produced into larger pieces of clothing. And again, before the Industrial Revolution, most textiles and garments existed on small scale in home productions. And these little workshops were called cottage industries, as we can see again in this image here. Merchants dropped off those raw materials, that cotton, that wool, that flax, to workers' homes where production relied on self-pacing and included low and both highly skilled workers. And kind of around the mid-1700s, we saw a series of inventions that led to what we know as the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution, again, was just a transition from new manufacturing processes, which occurred in Europe and the United States. Back in 1738, Lewis Paul and John Wyatt of England invented the roller spinner machine, which spun cotton into thread. In 1764, a multi-spool spinning wheel was able to spin thread more quickly than that previous invention back in the 1730s. And in 1770, the water frame was invented by Richard Arkwright. The water frame produced stronger threads and was powered by water. This particular invention really did pave the way to make textile production less of a cottage industry and more of a major manufacturing industry, and saw the rise of factories and led to the kind of working conditions we typically associate with the Industrial Revolution. And what we're looking at here right now is that arc-right water frame. Now, by the 1880s, large mills and factories produced fabric and garments, including coats, petticoats, trousers, socks, hats, shirts, gloves, you name it, these were being mass produced in factories. The mills and factories of Victorian era England offered grueling work at poverty wages. The air was filled with floating fibers that caused respiratory problems for these workers. They were also subject to dim lighting conditions, which ruined their eyesight, as well as toxic dyes they used on the clothes that also poisoned them. Now, workers typically in these factories were women and children, and they typically worked 12-hour days, although in the busy season, they could work anywhere from 12 to 20-hour days. And these conditions, I can't really overstate how bad these conditions were, especially for children. Children were routinely abused and beaten if they fell asleep on the factory floor or made any kind of mistakes. And so these unsafe working conditions sadly led to numerous tragedies like the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire in the Greenwich Village neighborhood, Manhattan in New York City back in 1911. The fire was one of the deadliest industrial accidents in New York City's history and one of the worst in our country's history. It caused the deaths of 146 garment workers. Most of those were women aged between 14 and 23, although 23 men did die from the fire as well. And it wasn't just a fire that killed these victims. It was smoke inhalation, folks falling and jumping from windows to their deaths. And the majority of these victims were Jewish and Italian immigrants. And here I have an expert from the US Department of Labor, specifically the OSHA office, that kind of paints a grim picture of how these unsafe work conditions caused a significant number of workers to lose their lives in this tragedy. The building had only one fire escape, which collapsed during the rescue effort. Long tables and bulky machines trapped many of the victims. Panicked workers were crushed as they struggled with doors that were locked by managers to prevent theft, or doors that opened the wrong way. Only a few buckets of water were on hand to douse the flames, and outside, firefighters' ladders were too short to reach the top windows. At the time, they were using something known as safety nets to catch people who jumped from these buildings, but the safety nets were ill-equipped to handle this and ripped like paper. So it's a very grim picture here at the Shirtwaist Fire Factory. But this did lead to legislation requiring improved factory safety standards and helped spur the growth of the International Ladies Garment Worker Union, which fought and advocated for better working conditions for sweatshop workers, both in New York domestically and worldwide. Now, also, while this was going on in lockstep with the fight to improve worker conditions, was that department stores increased their advertising and fed public's awareness of new styles that created demand for new looks. Where pre-industrial revolution designs lasted for years, now new fashions were appearing every season. We can see an advertisement right here of different garments at Daniels and Lowry Co. in Seattle, Washington. And so by the mid-20th century, this was kind of the state of things. We saw mass production increase. Styles became more simple and easier to reproduce. We did see an increase in wages and safety for both workers, and we saw a rise in the middle class, which led to a different class of folks that had purchasing power to buy those different articles of clothing. Corporations increased their advertising budgets to induce shoppers to spend. Retailers introduced lines more quickly, and we saw miracle fabrics being discovered. The first being polyester, which is a fiber derived from fossil fuels, and the other being rayon, which is a fiber derived from trees. And so this was the state of things by the late mid-20th century. And then we come to something called the 1990s. This decade is known for a lot of things, wacky designs and different uses of colors here. And you can see this represented in this slide that I made. I feel really good about this slide, so feel free to give me some good notes in the chat there. But the 1990s saw an era of deregulation that made the import of cheap apparel more advantageous for the garment industry. We saw thousands of workers lose their jobs. The NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, encouraged many folks in the garment industry, the domestic garment industry, to move their operations outside of the United States, where it caused wages to be lowered to remain competitive for those folks still working in the United States. Factories began to spring up in China and Bangladesh, and these factories utilized cheap labor, poor working conditions, and had minimal government oversight. These unregulated producers were free to pollute the air and discharge chemicals into waterways. And within these countries, workers had little protection, endured long working hours, low pay, and abuse. We can kind of see that as a through line throughout the fashion industry, both pre-industrial and post-industrial age. These working conditions kind of remain the same no matter where they were, either in industrialized England, the United States, and elsewhere in the Far East. And so that leads us to the era of fast fashion. And I think, there we go. That leads to the rise of what we know as fast fashion. Fast fashion was coined by the fashion retail industry to describe the quick turnover of designs that moved from the catwalk to current fashion trends and became increasingly and extremely unpopular in the early 2000s. This can kind of best be seen as the mass production of cheap, poor quality, and disposable clothing. So some of the stats that we have from the area of fast fashion that we currently live in, it's estimated that the fashion industry sells anywhere between 80 billion and 150 billion garments per year globally. Produces and sells. That represents anywhere from 10 to 20 garments for each person on the planet. You'll notice these asterisks here, and that's just because there's one thing I really do need to mention. In my research on sustainable fashion, you kind of see a couple of different stats that are represented in a lot of different places, but if you really dive deep into it, those stats don't really hold up and aren't necessarily peer reviewed, and that's because there's no real governing body for the global industry, the global fashion industry, doing any kind of concrete measuring on these numbers. And large-scale garment manufacturers are pretty tight-lipped and sometimes intentionally misleading about their products' waste and impact on the planet. So all that to say is, do be wary of the statistics you see here, because again, there is no governing body. Just kind of make sure that these statistics hold up and are completely true. So you will see kind of a wide variance of different things around the fashion industry and its environmental impact. So there are some things we do know. There is an environmental impact of the fashion industry as it stands today, from water usage, microfibers, greenhouse gases, deforestation, and human rights. And we're going to talk about those 5 topics a little bit more in depth next. What we're looking at right here is the Jiang River in Luoyang, China. That's in Henan province. And this is just a river that is fed by wastewater from different clothing factories in the area. Wastewater is a huge problem. In Bangladesh alone, 22,000 tons of toxic wastewater from tanneries goes straight into waterways and rivers each year. This toxic water affects the health of the wildlife and people who live along the banks of these waterways. And eventually these waterways lead to the sea, and it pollutes the oceans from there as well. It can take anywhere from 200 tons of fresh water to dye and finish just one fabric of clothing. Again, that's 200 tons of fresh water to dye and finish just 1 ton of fabric. So it's a lot of water being wasted there. And according to Extinction Rebellion and the United Nations, they found that almost 3.6 billion people, that's almost half of the world's population, are at risk of water scarcity at some point during this year. Next up, we have microfibers. Microfibers are microplastics that come away from synthetic fabrics like polyester and nylon every single time we wash our clothes. And each time we wash our clothes, it sheds around 700,000 individual microfibers. These are consumed by aquatic organisms, which are eaten by fish, which are then in turn eaten by humans. So this is kind of no surprise, as so I think the most recent estimates show that in a given month, every human ingests about a credit card's worth of plastic. So the plastic is polluting our environment, but it's also polluting our bodies. Greenhouse gas emissions, and again, please take this with a hard asterisk, anywhere from 3 to 10% of, I also am at home, so you might hear some dogs barking, but luckily I have a little water gun to keep dogs quiet. It's estimated that anywhere from 3 to 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from the fashion industry. Sorry, I'll just have to use the water gun. If that's true, that's more than aviation and maritime shipping industries combined. Producing and manufacturing and transporting the millions of garments produced each year uses a lot of energy. The synthetic fibers like polyester, nylon, and most of our clothing are generated from fossil fuels, and the countries in which the majority of our clothing is produced operate factories that are powered by coal. Looking at deforestation next, animals raised for their fur and wool can lead to overgrazing in certain areas of the world. Overgrazing can cause soil erosion, land degradation, loss of valuable plant species, food shortages, and famine. Each year, thousands of hectares of endangered and ancient rainforests, as well as other forms of forest, are felled each year and replaced by tree plantations that use typically pine, that go into wood-based fabrics like rayon and viscose. This harms indigenous communities disproportionately around the world as well. And then lastly, human rights. So we focus on a lot of kind of environmental factors here, but the conditions of the fashion industry workers is another reason why fast fashion is unethical, because it's in fact inhumane. Workers typically suffer from unbearably long working hours, terrible low pay, and extremely hazardous working conditions. And these are just some of the issues that garment workers still continue to face, hundreds of years after the Industrial Revolution. And similar to the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, there was another recent industrial accident, this time in Bangladesh. In 2013, the Rana Plaza disaster, which saw over 1,000 people die in the collapse of a building in the Bangladeshi garment industry. And that's just one example of how this work continues to be unsustainable and unsafe to this day. And then, so at this point, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and kind of transition over and introduce our guest today. We have Camila Sanders. She's the founder and CEO of Greater Than Equal. Camila, how are you doing today?
I am doing great.
Well, thank you for being here. Let's just get on into it. And one thing to mention before we do, again, any of the stats and the things like that I mentioned in today's presentation, I will be following up with in our email. If you have any questions, dear viewers, please put those in the chat. And after we can finish our questions up here, we will get to those in our Q&A section. But turning it back to you, Camila, could you start by telling us a little bit about yourself and the work you do?
Sure. So Kamilah Sanders, leadership and marketing consultant for creative social impact founders. And that's typically in the area of sustainable fashion, equity, climate justice, and the arts. And also, of course, you just mentioned founder and CEO of Greater Than Equal, which really seeks to connect sustainable, ethical actors along the supply chain. Locally, I also work with a lot of arts organizations kind of in the background, but then I also am president on the board of Tennessee Craft Midstate, which that organization seeks to further craft and give resources to local artisans in the Mid-State Nashville area. And also I am a Climate Reality Leader co-chair. So you're familiar with that. So shout out to anyone that's a Climate Reality Leader, but I also co-chair that with a wonderful group of people locally.
Yeah. So it seems like you have a lot of time on your hands, right? I'm just kidding.
Yes, absolutely.
Clearly a lot of free time.
Yeah.
So kind of digging into this question a little bit more, how did you get interested in this line of work?
So I admit, I am one of those people that since I was a child, I was like a tree hugger, I always, watched nature videos. I was always into saving the earth. quote unquote, right? The earth doesn't need saving. But I was always into those types of things. I was always into fashion because my mom was a seamstress. And so it's kind of surrounded by that my entire life. And as far as like the definition of sustainability now, like what people think of sustainable fashion, that was just my way of life, right? Like as far as like thrifting, hand-me-downs, all, my mom made clothes, like all of that was just a way of life before it was called anything. But I think really getting into the work, well, I used to be in retail fashion apparel. So I worked in the industry for a while. And then I also worked for Schneider Electric, which is an international corporation that is focused on sustainability. And then I got into the nonprofit space. And so really like this, me working in this is a culmination of everything that I'm passionate about, and then all of my background and experiences. And so that's kind of led me to, what I'm focusing on now.
Yeah. It's a really amazing journey. It's not too many folks that, at an early age, it's just like, here's where I am, here's what I'm living, here's what I'm interested in doing. And then that kind of just culminates into, oh, okay. So Camila, from a small young girl to the woman you are now, not too much variance there. If anything, you've only gotten more knowledgeable, right?
Exactly. And I was kind of like you when I started to get more into, because I think probably a long time ago, I was thinking, oh, sustainable fashion is about like the materials and organic cotton and all this stuff like that. But then when I got more into it, I'm like, whoa, this kind of combines everything,
Right. No, I mean, and just broadly speaking about like the kind of notion or the way people perceive sustainability, oftentimes doesn't take into account like the equity and the human impact of those decisions that we do make. So it kind of sounds like that's the intersection that you found and like where you've been for a while.
Exactly.
Yeah. So kind of moving on, we have a couple of questions here. This one comes from my co-hostess with the mostest, Jenn. It can be hard to determine whether or not a garment is truly sustainable, especially when you take greenwashing into account. Are there any brands that you're aware of that are truly committed to sustainability? And if so, what makes them different?
So this is an interesting question. And I answer this a little bit differently than most people, because I think that the brands that are most sustainable are going to be like your local designers, your local brands, your local artisans. So it's going to be different for anyone, right? There are plenty of people and makers in India or in a country in Africa or even locally that are making things in a sustainable manner. We just don't hear about them, right? So I would say anything that's not necessarily like those fast fashion brands and stuff like that. But if you can go to your local designer or your local boutique and talk to them and ask them, for example, I did a panel with Oil and Lumber, right? That's in Nashville for those that are not here, and Harry Clothing. And if you talk to them, like they know what the process is. They know that they're sustainable and ethical, and it's not that they're 100%, but it's a lot more than, this fast fashion brand. But I will say that, because you asked like what differentiates them, there is a brand that has been on my radar. Her name is Busayo, and it's BUSAYONYC.com. And the reason why this brand stands out for me is because I know the story behind the brand, right? So I know that one, the clothing is absolutely beautiful, but she takes techniques from making textiles and then kind of modernizes it, right? And her clothing is like a piece of art, right? And so I've been to events and I've heard her speak. And, it's like, oh, she's great. Like the story is great. So it's really just about knowing that story
Mhm.
that goes behind the brand and what they're doing and kind of what their ethos is. And to me, that attracts me. And I love the thought of clothing as like a piece of art. So,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. No, that's an amazing answer. I really like how you frame that, just because uh far too often I imagine just the easy answer is like, oh, Patagonia, or
Yeah,
like, or an Everlane,
exactly.
or like a whatever like that. And like, that's not to say those companies aren't doing great work. It's just those companies aren't based in Nashville, right?
Right. Right. It's going to be your local
Hmm.
designer that's not, doing all the things that you said, right?
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. Because one thing to remember is, those still have to come from somewhere, and if those materials aren't sourced locally, odds are there are designers and creators wherever you are that are kind of doing that exact same thing without having to go from over here, import things and use ships and stuff like that.
Exactly. And I forgot what I was going to say, but I mean, they'll be able to tell you what that is. And it's
Hmm.
it's not 100% perfect, but they'll be able to tell you like, oh, okay, well, this is where I got this.
Hmm.
So
And so that really leads well to this next question that I have for you, and it's, how do you know if something is made ethically or sustainably or not?
I would say you would ask. So, I mean, honestly, and I mean, you talk a bit about greenwashing, which
Mhm,
is like, oh, well, ask more questions about
mhm,
it. Ask about what the journey is. And honestly, if you talk to these larger brands, they don't even know what their supply chain is. Like
yeah,
they'll say, oh, well, I don't know,
mhm,
but a smaller brand will be able to tell you. And even if they can't necessarily tell you, they're not doing it in such a mass quantity that
mhm,
it's affecting the earth
mhm,
like and people like these other larger brands. So I would say ask. There's a ton of resources out there.
mhm,
I am a remake ambassador too. So they do have a brand directory. It is not exhaustive.
mhm,
But I would say ask, because it's going to be these local brands, local designers that create clothes and make clothes that are going to be the most sustainable. And they may not call themselves, oh, I'm sustainable, I'm ethical. A lot of people don't necessarily have the certifications. This is a
mhm,
smaller brand, but they still
mhm.
are. So,
Right. No, totally understand that, especially for those kind of smaller producers. The operations there are a lot smaller, so they don't have someone on staff who's like, oh, I'm a brand ambassador and I can tell you exactly where everything comes from. Like, you're going to be talking to people who, while they also have their bottom line in mind, they got into that industry because they're passionate about it, right? And
exactly.
so, like, those larger brands lend themselves more to having that advertising budget to tell that story, in commercials. But you go to an outlet, you're like, where did these jeans come from? And they're like,
Yeah, and a lot of times, like if you talk to someone in the indigenous community,
mhm,
they didn't know to use, like I didn't know to use the word sustainable when I'm
mhm,
doing sustainable things. Like that's just a new thing. Like, oh, I'm gonna, advertise this way, but it's not like this is just a way of life, you know?
mhm. Yeah. Well,
So,
and we were talking about that before we got things started, about how fast fashion and the relationship we have with clothes is a relatively new thing in our journey as a human species.
right,
As I mentioned in the primer, for the majority of our species existence, clothes were made individually and by hand at home. And it's only been in the past maybe 200 years or less where that's transitioned to not being the case by and large.
right.
Yeah. And so you mentioned supply chains, and then this next question that I have kind of touches off on that a little bit. And it's hard to truly know the impact that the fashion industry has on the environment, but we know it's very resource intensive and touches many industries, both animal and plant agriculture, petroleum, forestry, mining, and with such a wide ranging supply chain. Where do you see gateways of entry for making the industry one that's more sustainable as a whole?
Honestly, I think that it's going to take everyone in every single part. So I don't think it's one thing. Everything is so interconnected.
Hmm.
But I do think that you have to start to support and connect kind of the people along the supply chain that are ethical and that are sustainable versus supporting these, the larger, mass produced actors along the supply chain.
Right, right.
So I think it's going to take all of us. It's going to take every single area.
Yeah, and like I mentioned, like there are so many industries that are touched in order to just produce one pair of jeans, including transportation and all these other things. And it's yet, like you said, it's not just going to be one thing, because if we start to address, let's just say, the shipping costs and the shipping toll of fashion, and if we want to make that more equitable and sustainable, like the downstream effects are, okay, we have to look at all the systems that are at play and adjust and kind of look at those through a lens of equity and sustainability as well.
Exactly. You really have to take a systems approach, because that's how it works. How everything works, really.
Yeah. And kind of if you had a magic wand, I always love asking these kind of questions. If you had a magic wand, what's one thing you would change about the way large producers do things right now, as far as making their products more sustainable? And your wand can do something in the short term right now, and also kind of do a spell for long-term goals.
They would not exist, but no.
All right.
Let's just get rid of them. No, seriously. So really, I think that they, like these larger producers, they have to transition, right? It's not a choice anymore. They have to transition, because we're talking about human rights. We're talking about what's happening on the earth. I don't know about you, but this heat in Nashville is ridiculous. People are like, oh, it hasn't been this hot in a long, like, I don't remember it being this hot. Or the smog over Nashville, like our entire West Coast is burning. like in a sense, like it has to transition. It's not a choice at this moment. And you think about the larger corporations, it is a slow moving thing, right? So as much as they're starting to transition, it's not a fast transition, right? But I will say that something that they can start doing to make that transition, I would say, is hire Black and brown people, right? And it seems kind of disjointed, but we know that the majority of corporations, even in the fashion industry, but any corporations, any of these large organizations, most of the people in the executive suite are white male, right? We know that. And so hiring Black and brown people, and even women, is shown that you are going to be able to innovate faster. Everything is going to be because you have people that are not thinking the same, right? We're thinking of innovative ways. And we're also thinking through a lens of empathy, because I don't know, and this is going on for years, just like you addressed in the beginning, I don't know how you could be making millions of dollars over here, and then there's a garment maker over here not able to make a living wage, making $2 an hour, an equivalent of that, and not being able to feed her family, right? And so, and you're thinking about just the impact that has on, women's rights and, all different kinds of things. And it's like, how, like, how do you justify that? How do you change it to a model where you're focused on people globally and kind of creating that? And so I think that a lot of times you have to get people in there that are closer to the issue, people that can say, because I know that when I think of that situation, I can relate to my own experiences. I can relate to people that I know, and I can make a decision, even though when you are in that type of environment, you're still working within that system, but it needs to transition. And that's one of the ways to transition if we're talking about those big producers.
Wow. Great answer there. And you mentioned something as well that I failed to mention, is that We don't know how many garment workers there are worldwide. It's estimated anywhere from, there are 300 million to 600 million. But primarily those garment workers are women and young girls, right?
Right.
And so kind of addressing that top-down issue of lack of representation and lack of engagement. It's top-down when we're talking about in the CEO boardroom, but like also from the ground up, we're talking about women who are working in these deplorable conditions and don't have, their basic human rights and needs met.
Yeah, and you think, and that's kind of why I love like the fashion industry. We talked about all this negative things, but it has the power to impact the world, right? Because you think about poverty levels and other, issues like, mostly like the fashion industry employs like a significant number of women across the world, right? It affects, economics. So it has the power, if it shifts in the right direction, to change a lot of things that's happening globally.
Yeah, no, totally agree with you there. And then also I feel like as consumers in Western nations and developed nations, we have that responsibility because it's so easy to say, oh, well, they're using coal in China or they're using coal in Bangladesh. Why don't they use solar, without like saying, okay, why is it that the industry moved to Bangladesh, right? Why is it that, the countries that have more wealth are kind of exporting their pollution to other places in the global South and in the Far East? It's kind of like a reverse colonialization as a means of like just putting pollution elsewhere. And if we're going to get serious, we need to have those kind of conversations. And also, if we're going to get serious, we need to take responsibility as countries that kind of perpetuated that and continue to release the majority of the greenhouse gases on this planet, right?
Exactly, and it's affecting the global South first,
yes,
before it's affecting the North.
Yes,
right?
exactly.
But the North are the ones that are polluting, right? So
yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
We can talk about that for a whole nother like couple of hours, but
I know. I feel like we were almost just about to be like, well, I have a lot more to say on that subject.
That's another conversation. That's another meeting.
We can save that for the sustainable fashion part 2.
Yeah.
I misspoke earlier because I read a question to you that I wrote, but this one actually is from a co-host, Jenn. Buying clothes that are fashionable as well as sustainably and ethically made can come with a high price tag. What advice do you have for someone who is shopping on a tight budget?
So I would say sustainability is not about buying something, right? So there's so many different ways that you can do it. I mentioned before about thrifting. I also mentioned, or also you can just keep the clothes that you have in your closet and wear those. Or when you do purchase something that is going to last, right? So purchase something that is quality, that's maybe made of different materials. So, research that, but wool, cotton, materials that actually, can biodegrade. That's a whole nother research thing, but stay tuned to Urban Green Lab. They can tell you all about that. But, buying better materials that will last, because I know that, if I buy something from one of these fast fashion brands, like it's going to last me a day, right? Buying clothes that you absolutely love, because there's some clothes that I have like years and years and years, and they're from like this designer. I will never get rid of that because I absolutely love it. So there's so many different ways to do it. It's not necessarily about buying. You don't have to buy anything new. You can wear, if you have an H&M shirt in your closet, wear that. Don't get rid of it. Like that's what you can do. And I think it's just more about values. It's more about those everyday decisions that you decide to do. It's not necessarily about buying something.
And we got a lot of love in the chat. I'm seeing folks talking about turnip green creative reuse, this and that. There are Goodwill, other kind of those organizations. So it doesn't necessarily have to. What's that?
Oh, I was reading the comments too. Like sew your clothes. There's a sewing training center here. Like there's so many. They mentioned turnip green and the fabrics. Like there's so many different things that you can do. Have swap parties. Like there's so much to do. Upcycle, I've upcycled my entire life before it was called upcycling, you know? So yeah, there's tons of things that you can do. Repair.
Well, and I like the mention of turnip green creative reuse, because you can really get creative. Like with a shirt that has holes in it, instead of throwing that away, ask yourself, what could this better be used for? For me personally, my partner turns in like clothes that would be thrown away into dog toys, and the dogs
Oh,
loved running around with shirts and stuff. So I don't know. But that's just a small thing you can do. You can turn those things into like kind of like dish naps for the kitchen or something like that, or to clean up.
exactly.
You have a world of options, as only as limiting as your mind makes them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Love that.
So next question I have for you here is, systemically, what role, if any, do you see governments in playing in addressing these issues?
I do think that governments definitely play a role. The fashion industry is not typically regulated. I think it's starting to happen now, but not typically. It's not typically regulated by the government. But I think that definitely has to happen, because these larger brands have been doing what they've been doing for a long time, right? And so what is going to make them actually take a huge shift is regulation, right? But you do have to realize that citizens really control what happens with the government, right? It starts with us as a collective first. We make a fuss about it. We talk about it. We say what we want. We vote, and then the government shifts. So I think that they do play a role, but if we want to see things, we start on our end.
I guess I'm just getting so much stuff happening outside of my front porch. I got another dog barking. But no, totally agree with you there. And kind of like the flip side of that is, what power do we as consumers have to influence those large retail producers in the current unsustainable trajectory of that industry?
We have a lot of power. I don't think we give ourselves enough credit, right? And I see that firsthand because, as I mentioned, I'm a Remake It ambassador, right? And they have the Pay Up campaign. So basically, that Pay Up campaign is basically where during the pandemic, a lot of manufacturers did not pay their bills when they had the orders. And so a lot of the garment makers were not getting paid on the other end, right? And so Remake got their community together, and they basically the entire community will email these companies, and they'll there's a lot of power behind it. There's petitions for garment worker rights, and also the Pay Up campaign. So you can go to payupfashion.com and sign a petition. So look for these different groups that are really catalyzing and joining people together that are passionate and that are doing actionable things. And as a collective, we do have a lot of power to do.
Yeah. It's a great response. I'm kind of just stuck on like the comment you made about if you had a magic wand for like long term, we wouldn't have any of these large producers, where the supply chains would be domestic across the globe, right? And oh, what a wonderful world that would be. And for me, it's just, you can see that the large producers are seeing this as well, where they'll have specific brands that kind of meet that need of being local and things like that, while also still mass producing these and having like nightmarish supply chains. So I think, I know if you had a magic wand, that would be the case, but I'm going to go ahead and predict, I think that's the way we're going to see things going, where local creators get more of a market share in regards to fashion and folks' kind of mindsets, as opposed to like just going to I'm not going to pick on any big brands. They just go to the mall and they get a shirt that they need, as opposed to kind of a shifting thought process of, okay, I need a shirt, maybe I'll go to the Goodwill or see if there's a local producer that has something that can best suit my needs. I'm hoping and predicting that I think that's where things will go, because that's where things need to go.
Right. And I mean, you can see it like a lot of people are like, shop local, So I definitely think that's a direction. And not saying that, the entire supply chain is not always local. We
Mhm.
try to be local, but it's not always, you're not going to find everything locally.
Right.
But the more important thing is that it's sustainable and ethical, right?
Mhm.
And so we want to be able to, if you can't do it locally, to get from a manufacturer that's sustainable and that's ethical. Or if you're getting wool, it's from a farm that's sustainable and ethical
Mhm.
versus, just having this kind of, huge messed up system.
Right, right. And
Yeah.
one thing to remember, kind of expound on that, is cotton can't be grown everywhere in the world. Sheep can't be raised everywhere in the world. But that shouldn't preclude you from like seeking out those sustainable brands, because you can raise sheep in a sustainable way wherein folks are able to make a livable wage and get everything that they need. You can buy cotton that is grown in a sustainable way, while also ensuring that everyone's human rights are met and their needs are met.
Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting because it's interesting that we're even having this conversation, right? Like, shouldn't business practices be ethical?
Yeah.
Like, it's amazing that we're even having this conversation if you think about it. Like, it's
With the
just
back,
the way it should be.
which is the backdrop of remember I mentioned this in the primer. It's like specifically with the fashion industry, these issues have never gone away.
Right.
Full
Well,
stop.
that's
Like,
how it was built. That's how the system was built,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
So
It's like we're
that's
touching. I feel like we're touching off again on that sustainable fashion part two. But I got two more questions for you before we turn it over to the Q&A. Thinking on the current human toll of the industry, what are some of the benefits of transitioning to a sustainable fashion model? And I know you had already touched off on some of this in your previous responses.
Yeah, and I think it's exactly what you said, right? It's the local artisan being the loudest voice in the room versus these other large brands. I think it's always interesting to me when I look back at my purchases
Mm-hmm.
and I think about how attracted I was to a ethnic design in a store that might be okay, I won't name any names, but a store, and it's like, okay, this was actually like culturally appropriated.
Mm-hmm.
Why can't I get this same thing from someone in Nigeria?
Mm-hmm.
That's actually, it's from that culture. Like, why can't I go directly to that culture to get something? So I think it's about the elevation of these, the benefits would be the elevation of these brands or,
Mm-hmm.
makers that we don't even hear about, right? It's about, you know, um, people actually being able to make a living off of the things that they make versus
Mm-hmm.
it only being a corporation that's able to make a living. And then I also think even more like what we were just talking about the climate, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
that's definitely a benefit, is
Mm-hmm.
thinking about the benefits toward 2030 and our
Mm-hmm.
climate goals. Like,
Mm-hmm.
that's a huge benefit
Right.
that I would, yeah, that I think is important.
Yeah, no, that full stop right there, like that.
Yeah.
Yes.
No.
Yeah. And yeah, again, we're not going to drag any brands, but we know who we're thinking of, because there's also many of them. And so the last question I have for you today is to the folks viewing right now and to the folks who will later view this on YouTube in the future, be sure to subscribe, what's one thing or one things you think everyone should remember when it comes to being a responsible consumer as it relates to fashion?
I think one thing is to remember that it's not 100% perfect. Like, you're not going to say, "Oh, I'm going to be sustainable and I'm not going to buy anything, or I'm going to buy this expensive." Like, that's not what it's about, right? It's about values. It's about the decisions that you make every single day. That's
Mm-hmm.
just like when you say, "Oh, I'm going to eat better, but I'm going to make a decision, every single day to do this." It's about what you know, and it's about you making the best decision that you can. So it's
Mm-hmm.
not a 100% thing. Just try one thing out. If that works, do something else, and just continue in that path that will get you more to a more, sustainable style, right? But then also when you talk to brands, don't think that it's a 100% journey for them either, right?
Mhm.
Because no brand is 100% sustainable and everyone has different definitions, right?
Mhm.
So recognize that when you're talking to brands, you're not going to find somebody that's perfect, but find someone that has that ethos, that
Mhm.
is trying to be as close as they can. And I think that that's more important. And I will say also, I know it's more than one thing, but but don't underestimate your own power,
Mhm.
right? And your own influence, because I think that we have influence over one, we have influence when we vote, right?
Mhm.
Vote, get involved with other communities that are doing the same thing. But then also when you're doing something, talk about it, whether it's to your friends or your family or whatever it is, like, don't be afraid to have those conversations with the
Mhm.
people around you, or even just living by example in
Yeah.
a sense.
Yeah.
Wear your
Uh,
clothes more than once.
yeah. Wise words. Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's not going to be take a day to equitably transition to a just sustainable fashion industry and those downstream effects. So start small, talk to people about things, and collective action is the name of that game. Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, Camila Sanders, founder, CEO of Greater Than Equal, that is all I have for you as far as the questions go today. I want to turn things over to my co-host, Jenn Harrman, with some questions from our Q&A.
All right. Oh my gosh. Thank you so much for this. I feel like as someone who is into deals so much with traditional recycling, I feel like you could have replaced fashion with the word plastic and all of this. And it's the exact same conversation, 100% across the board in terms of all of the issues and um, anyway, this was absolutely excellent. And for those of you, I will say that for those of you that do have to head out to the rest of your day, thank you for joining us and being here on your lunch hour. We will pop our next episode into the chat. I'm going to share my screen really quick just so that you can really quickly see. Our next episode is, oops, I forgot to edit it. It's sustainable events. Please forgive me. It's August 11th at noon, but it's sustainable events. We just did fashion. But we will be doing that with Dennis Freeman, who has run Live on the Green and is going to talk about how to manage and how they manage sustainable events and how they're looking to manage Live on the Green when it comes back, hopefully next year, and how they do that. So don't forget to sign up for that. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen. And we'll jump into our questions.
Jen, if I can add something here. I
Yes.
found it very interesting that you said you could replace sustainable fashion, the word fashion, with plastic recycling. Consider that the majority of clothes are made out of plastic, and we are
Yes,
having
they
a
are.
conversation.
Yes, absolutely. And when I think about the policy and the regulation and the extended producer responsibility, if you're advocating for that for on the plastic side, that's going to impact the fashion industry. Because I would bet $5, as you did earlier, that if the majority of you went and looked at your tag right now, you're probably wearing oil. Which plastic is made from. So just keep that in mind as well. And pulling up our questions now, don't forget to pop those in as you have them. So our first one is, considering the harmful effects of the fashion industry on the planet, what is the intersectionality with the animal agriculture industry? It seems very difficult to consider one without the other. And I think you all touched a little bit on this, but I will throw that to you.
Yeah, I'll start off, I guess. And I know, Patrick, you did a ton of research. Wow. So agriculture, how does it touch that? Well, if you think about it, all of our clothes, or not all of them, right? We just talked about plastic and oil, but we talked about the deforestation. We talked about how our clothes are made from cotton, right? So you can imagine, like, all of the cotton that's needed to produce, right? And I don't know how far to get into this, but it's definitely tied. If you think about the the Indian agriculture farmers, the protests from last year, a lot of that had to do, a lot of them are growing cotton, right? And a lot of them are having to do all these pollutants and a lot of chemicals that are happening with it. And so just if you think about agriculture, that's a huge thing in the fashion industry. You think about farming, you think about wool, what are those practices? Like that's ties hand in hand. In the other industry, what was the other one that you mentioned?
They just said animal, I think just.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. And well, I mean, you can so when Patrick was talking about like all the dyes and everything that goes into that, I mean, we're thinking about leather, like leather comes from an animal, right? And basically the amount of chemicals and the dyeing process that goes into whether it's denim or whether it's leather, like that affects that local community, right? Where you saw that picture of a person that their rivers are dyed. They can't play in the water. They can't drink the water. There's birth defects there. Like there's all, I mean, it all ties together.
Yeah.
So if that's enough explanation, but yeah.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is, we can really get down into the nitty gritty of fashion, and with most things in this industrialized and connected world, it's a conversation about supply chains. Where what you wear has to come from somewhere. Wool comes from sheep and goats, so you have to raise those animals. Those animals have to eat things. If that's not done in a sustainable way, that leads to degradation of soils and all those other kind of downstream effects. Same thing with cotton. We're not just walking around wearing cotton balls. The cotton is dyed and spun into different colors and dyes. So at all stops of the burgeoning fashion industry, or like those primary inputs, they have to come from somewhere. And part of that conversation is with animals and agriculture, thinking wool and cotton. The larger part of that is oil, right? And so we're still drilling for oil right now. So it's yeah, Camila, I see the issue you were having. I have so much more to say, but I'm not sure how helpful. But, the clear linkages is wool, cotton comes from somewhere. It has to be either raised or grown. That affects people's lives. That affects the planet.
Yeah, and just to reiterate too that most of our clothing is made from oil now. I think we've gotten away from just being able to go to the store and buy something that is cotton or silk or wool that's a natural fabric. We used to be able to do that. Now everything's polyester, right? Or rayon, right? And so just, keep that in mind that that's the majority of our clothing now.
Yeah. Oh, and also, great point mentioning rayon. That comes from trees, primarily pine trees. So there are tree farms, just, acres and acres of trees that are only being used to make fabric. So that's another part of that agriculture. You have cotton, wool, and just trees in and of themselves being farmed for fabric.
This is a perfect transition into our next question, because you're mentioning all these different types of fabrics and materials, and someone asked what are good long-lasting materials to look for in clothing. But I think you could extend that to kind of, what are some materials that are going to be more sustainable versus ones that really folks maybe should avoid if they can?
I think it's really just look at any natural fibers. So for example, we mentioned wool, we mentioned cotton, which is a whole nother story about cotton, but we won't go too far into that. But things like hemp and, other things like that, any of your natural materials, right? And I will put a note or kind of an asterisk, okay, you get your jeans, right? Your denim, if it has lycra in it, like that's plastic, so that's not going to be something, but you can look. I think there's a documentary, but you can look, and like a lot of these clothing, for example, if I had something that was 100% wool or organic cotton, I could put it in my compost, You know what I'm saying?
Mhm.
So, and it's about, creating those circular systems, but being able to take something and say, hey, I can wear this for a long time.
Mhm.
But then if I don't wear it anymore, I can return it to the earth. Like, I feel really good about that. But I don't know if you want to add to that.
I would just add two things to it as far as like when you're looking for, or you're shopping for clothing, or you're looking for new articles of clothing, go with things that you're familiar with, right? Like if you're asking yourself, well, what's rayon, what's polyester, what's, what are these things, what's nylon? Those exist over here. Now, I don't know what those things are, and if it sounds like a made up word that you never heard of, it's probably made from oil or a less sustainable product. But things like cotton, that's familiar. Cotton is familiar. Wool is familiar. Wool, sheep. And then I saw someone also mention hemp in the chat. Hemp is also another sustainable fabric, or a sustainable plant that can create fabric. And then the second thing I want to mention is, if you're curious about cotton, cotton is the story of America. And we'll save that probably for part 3, Camila, but cotton, cotton. So much of the state of the world we live in now can be traced back to cotton and cotton production.
Yeah, and one thing that I'll just say this really quick. One thing that I was thinking of when you were giving that presentation is really the Industrial Revolution, and the whole fashion industry and supply chain was able to exist because of slavery.
Mm-hmm.
And people, Black and brown people, picking cotton, right? Because where do you think that they got all the materials for those clothes? So that's what we were talking about, kind of, it's always built on the backs of Black and brown people. And that's how the entire fashion industry was built. And it continues to this day, right? Because we have the garment makers that are creating clothes, and then you have people, so yeah, but we won't, that's part 2. Okay.
I'm gonna stand on my soapbox a little bit here, because that's how the fashion industry was built, and that's how this country was built. Where do we find, how was there just all this available land to produce all of this cotton? Where did the people come to work those fields? So it's free labor, slavery, it's free land, genocide of Native Americans, and that's where all of the wealth comes from, like just cotton.
Exactly.
But that'll be for part 2 and 3.
Jumping to our next question. So there weren't really questions. It was kind of more of just some folks wanting to, thought that we would share a little bit more about how to recycle and dispose of old clothes. So having those leftover clothes and materials that they just don't know what to do with. And there's been a lot of really good, you all have already given some really good examples. There's been some really good examples in the chat. But is there anything else about recycling clothes that you all can think of to share? I know that Goodwill does do some recycling, but I don't know a whole lot about that program to say much more about that. So I wasn't sure if y'all had some info.
I have a couple of thoughts, because kind of early on in my sustainability journey, I was like, okay, what do I do with clothes that aren't fit to give away, but I don't want to throw away? And you'll find research and different articles online about different companies and corporations that do recycle clothes. But I'm always someone who likes to ask the next question is, okay, well, what does that mean? And what you're going to be met with primarily is, this is a proprietary thing. We can't say what goes into those recycled clothes, where they go. So I'm always hesitant to drop those off in a recycling clothes bin, because I don't know where they go. So for myself, specifically for articles of clothing that are unfit to give away, again, I either make dog toys, or honestly, if they're not 100% cotton, I just hold on to them until I find something better to do with them that I feel comfortable with.
I would agree with that. Try to either give it to someone or find something to do with it. A lot of people don't realize that when you donate clothes, and I know sometimes we donate clothes that nobody can probably wear, right? But a great portion of those clothes that we donate, people don't realize it does go to the global South, right? Mm-hmm. And it goes and bails to the global South, and it messes up the economy there. And when they can't use those clothes, it goes to their landfills, right? So they're having more pollution there because that's where we're sending all of our clothes that we don't want here. There's just so much that we have that we don't even wear half the time.
Yeah.
So I would say, make use of it, swap, do what you can as much as you can before you put it into a thrift shop.
Yeah. Yeah. And then there's always local organizations that are looking for specific articles of clothing. Different shelters and homes that are like, we need 20 pairs of men's slacks, or, where they have those specific items. So that's why I'm always hesitant to throw things away, just in general, because there is a high possibility that in your local community, if not now, and then sometime in the future, somebody is going to have a need for those articles.
That's so true. And I mean, especially we saw that during the tornado, but even now, like if you reach out to any of these community organizations, and I even sometimes reach out to your group of people. So how on Facebook you have those neighborhood groups, and say my kids or even you're like, oh, I want to toss out these clothes. Put a post and say, hey, does anyone need this? Or if you can find a family in need and post for them and say, hey, this person needs this. Do you have these sizes? Like people always have a ton of clothes to give, So I think it's all about that community, sharing too.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm gonna jump to a question that just came in. What about undergarments? I thought that was an interesting question. Just in general, so they said consuming less seems to be the best option. Only buy what you need and really love. But undergarments, they certainly are something that are a little bit more complicated in terms of those next use options. So are there other options? I think I love that, Camila, you had mentioned if you buy cotton, you can compost it. So if they're cotton and you pull out anything that might be in it that's not cotton, like wires and things, you can compost it. But are there any other thoughts or options on those?
So there are a lot of kind of newer companies that do have not necessarily a buyback, but once the product reaches the end of its life with you, they do have programs where you can send that back and they will use that to make newer products for that company. Again, I'm not really sure as to the inner mechanics of how that works because, again, folks are very tight-lipped about their proprietary processes. But that is an option. And also with for larger retailers like Hanes and things like that, they are offering programs where you can send underwear that is, or undergarments that are unwearable for you. While, I'm not too sure about their processes, I am a fan of any corporations or companies that do try to take care and become responsible for their products in their end of life. So again, a grain of salt with all of that stuff, but there are companies that do that, both those newer and small scale and those kind of larger producers.
Yeah, I'll say that you're starting to see that more because now it's like, okay, so why should the company made that product? Why should we be responsible for the disposal of it? You know, what do we do when it's over? So a lot of companies are starting to do that. I'll tell you something that I learned, and maybe this might be new for some people, but they actually make undergarments out of wool too, right? And you would think wool is itchy and it's weird or whatever, but there's so many different things that you can do with wool that people are starting to do. So there's undergarments, there's, clothing, there's athletic wear and things like that are wool now. So I would say, check that out. So there's a lot. It sounds funny, right? But wool can be stretchy and all different kinds of things. That's what I discovered. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, there are options. You just need to maybe do a little bit more research.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. And this next question, I don't know. You may or may not have an answer. I thought it was interesting. I now refuse to buy anything from polyester. Those of us that have some garments we bought before we became, those of us that have some garments we bought before we became so aware, those polyester items, I don't want to landfill them, but don't want to wash and get microplastics in the water. I have read there is something you can wash with that that catches the microplastics, and they were wondering if anybody knows about that. I actually am not familiar with that, and maybe I should do some research on this, but I'm not sure if anybody.
I actually got one of those like little microfiber balls. It's just like a little ball that you put in the wash and it catches microfibers. I'm not sure if it's like 100% of microfibers, but it's doing something there. I'm not sure what they called. I can run to the laundry room and grab it to show you, but again, I'm not sure what it's called. Camila, while I do that, I'm gonna hand it over to you.
That's great. There are filters that you can also buy for that. Yeah.
Well, hopefully we'll have Patrick come back and show us his neat little contraption. Just another good question about how everything is so interconnected. Oh, he's back. Did you find it?
So this is the thing. You can see it's got a lot of ridges and things like that on the inside, and it's also got some fibers already caught in it right now.
Oh, wow. Nice.
Yeah.
Cool.
So I wish I had more. This was a gift. I wish I had more information on where it came from or what exactly it's called, but there are some things you can do to catch those microfibers.
Cool.
And and the only thing I was going to add there is very similar to how we were saying about companies being responsible for their end-of-life products. A lot of large corporations are now doing polyester buybacks because that can be recycled to make shoes, new clothes, XYZ.
Exactly.
Nice.
Yeah.
Awesome. And I don't see any other questions right now in the chat. So I'm going to just throw one that I had, a small question. We talked a little bit about policy and regulation on a kind of larger scale. And I know when it comes to thinking about that extended producer responsibility of these corporations, that it really has got to come more from the federal government, and those bigger policies rather than starting locally can be really difficult. So I'm just curious if there's any, other than some of the plastic policies that I know that are being circulated at the federal level, if there's any other more fashion specific or this particular supply chain specific policy or regulation that's out or being talked about, or that folks can look into, research, and potentially support or contact their elected officials to support.
I don't know of anything specifically. I do know that there, of course, if you visit the Remake website, there is a Garment Workers Rights Act that is out of California that people can support. I also think that when you are supporting any initiative that is around climate, and you talk to your, so yes, we need federal regulation, but a lot of that does start local. Like local affects so much, right? And so if it's anything that is related to climate regulation, I would say call and support around that, because that's going to trickle down to whatever else happens within the industry.
Yeah.
And
the only thing I would add to that is I'm not sure if there are any like fashion specific related policies or initiatives taking place, but I know there is one about a carbon tax, right? And that would affect all industries, including the fashion industry. So, yeah.
Cool. Well, with that, we don't have any additional questions that I'm seeing. We've had some really great conversation in the chat. I will say some really good resources. So we'll pull through those for our follow-up email. But with that, I think we will sign off for the afternoon. Thank you so much, Camila, for being here. This has been a really, really good conversation today. I hope you folks at home have enjoyed it, and we'll share it when we share it with you. Share it with your friends, your family, your enemies. Everybody should watch this one. This was really, really good. So with that, Patrick, you've got anything else?
I got nothing else. To everyone who attended today's session, I hope you enjoyed it. Big shout out and huge thank you to Camila for giving us your time today and lending your expertise to this conversation. I look forward to talking to y'all. Is it in 2 weeks? Is our next one, or is that 3 weeks? Feels like a 2
I
weeks.
think it's I don't have my calendar up. I feel like it's 3 weeks.
I'll see everybody in 2 to 3 weeks. We're going to talk about sustainable events. As always, thanks for attending. And if you can, do something nice for yourself and someone else. And until then, take care, y'all.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Later, y'all.